Hello and welcome to my presentation of the book The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And the reason I've chosen this book in particular is because I had come acquainted with the main character, Dorian Gray, via movies and television series. He stars in a film called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and recently I've seen Dorian, well actually a different type of Dorian, and a different actor as well, in a television series called Penny Dreadful, which also includes other characters, especially from the gothic novel period, such as Dracula, Dr. Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll. Now, because I didn't know the full story behind this mysterious person, Dorian Gray, of course I do know about his power, which I will not spoil right now. However, I never knew the story around him and his motives. So I had decided to read this story and find out myself instead of surfing through a couple of summaries on the internet. During this presentation, I will go through the story and present a number of key moments which are important for the plot. Hopefully I can briefly summarize, or should I say, paint a clear picture about what happened and use a handful of quotes from those particular scenes which I found most interesting. The story sets in London in the 1890s at the home of his aunt, where Dorian Gray meets the well-known artist Basil Hallward. Dorian is immediately captured by Basil's artistic imagination for being an impossibly beautiful young man. When the novel starts, the artist is working on his first portrait of Dorian as he truly is, but he tells his friend Lord Henry Walton that the painting reveals too much of his feelings for his subject. Lord Henry, a famous wit who enjoys scandalizing his friends by celebrating youth, beauty, and the selfish pursuit of pleasure, disagrees, claiming that the portrait is Basil's masterpiece. Dorian arrives at the studio and Basil reluctantly introduces him to Lord Henry, who he fears will have a damaging influence on the impressionable young Dorian. Basil's fears are well founded. Before the end of their first conversation, Lord Henry upsets Dorian with a speech about the passing nature of beauty and youth. Worried that these, his most impressive characteristics, are fading day by day, Dorian curses his portrait, which he believes will one day remind him of the beauty he will have lost. In a fit of distress, he pledges his soul if only the painting could bear the burden of age and infamy, and allowing him to stay forever young. After Dorian's outbursts, Lord Henry reaffirms his desire to own the portrait. However, Basil insists the portrait belongs to Dorian. Over the next few weeks, Lord Henry's influence over Dorian grows stronger. The youth becomes a disciple of the new hedonism and proposes to live a life dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. He falls in love with Sybil Vane, a young actress who performs in a theatre in London's slums. He adores her acting. She, in turn, refers to him as Prince Charming and refuses to heed the warnings of her brother, James Vane, that Dorian is no good for her. Overcome by her emotions for Dorian, Sybil decides that she can no longer act, wondering how she can pretend to love on stage now that she has experienced the real thing. Dorian, who loves Sybil because of her ability to act, cruelly breaks his engagement with her, and after doing so, he returns home to notice that his face in Basil's portrait has changed. Now, before I continue with the plot overview of the story, I will read a part where Dorian comes home after ending his engagement with Sybil and sees something has changed in the portrait. As he was passing through the library towards the door of his bedroom, his eyes fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back in surprise, and then went over to it and examined it. In the dim arrested light that struggled through the cream-coloured silk blinds, the face seemed to him to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly curious. He turned around and, walking to the window, drew the blinds up. The bright dawn flooded the room and swept the fantastic shadows into dusky corners, where they lay shuddering. But the strange expression that he had noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty around the mouth as clearly as if he had been looking into a mirror after he had done some dreadful thing. He winced, and, taking up from the table an oval glass framed in ivory cupids that Lord Henry had given him, he glanced hurriedly into it. No line like this warped his red lips. What did it mean? He rubbed his eyes and came close to the picture and examined it again. There were no signs of any change when he looked into the actual painting, and yet there was no doubt that the whole expression had altered. It was not a mere fancy of his own. The thing was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly there flashed across his mind what he had said in Basil Hallward's studio the day the picture had been finished. Yes, he remembered it perfectly. He had uttered a mad wish that he himself might remain young and that the portrait grow old, that his own beauty might be untarnished, and the face of the canvas bear the burden of his passions and his sins, that the painted image might be seared with the lines of suffering and thought, and that he might keep all the delicate bloom and loveliness of his then just conscious boyhood. Surely his prayer had not been answered. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous even to think of them, and yet there was the picture before him, with the touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty! Had he been cruel? It was the girl's fault, not his. He had dreamed of her as a great artist, had given his love to her because he had thought her great. Then she had disappointed him. She had been shallow and unworthy. So in this part of the story, Dorian realizes that the painting has been cursed, that his sins and wrongdoings will transform the picture. And he recalls that he actually had spoken of some miracle, that he would keep his youth, and that the painting would alter. Now that he is confronted by his own fantasy, he first refuses to accept his behavior, which led to the changes in the painting, and blaming Sybil. So it seems to me like he is having an altercation with himself. Now that he is aware of the canvas displaying his sins and true age, he wants to see if he can undo what had been done to the painting by making amends with Sybil the next day. And the following afternoon, however, Lord Henry brings news that Sybil has killed herself. At first Dorian is devastated, but Lord Henry urges Dorian to forget what happened and to move on, and so Dorian does. He hides his portrait in a remote room upstairs, where no other than he can watch its transformation. At the end of their conversation, Henry tells Dorian the following. Life has everything in store for you, Dorian. There is nothing that you, with your extraordinary good looks, will not be able to do. But suppose, Henry, I became haggard and grey and wrinkled, what then? Ah, then, said Lord Henry, then, my dear Dorian, You would have to fight for your victories. As it is, they are brought to you. No, you must keep your good looks. We live in an age that reads too much to be wise and that thinks too much to be beautiful. On the next page, the conversation ends and Lord Henry leaves the house. But I will continue reading a few lines what Dorian does next. As soon as he had left, he rushed to the screen and drew it back. No, there was no further change in the picture. It had received the news of Sybil Vane's death before he had known of it himself. It was conscious of the events of life as they occurred. The vicious cruelty that marred the fine lines of the mouth had, no doubt, appeared at the very moment that the girl had drunk the poison, whatever it was, or was it indifferent to results? Did it merely take cognizance of what passed within the soul? He wondered and hoped that some day he would see the change taking place before his very eyes. So it is quite clear that Dorian is struggling with the painting's secret powers, and which actions and choices in his life leads to changes in the painting. So he continues to contemplate, but at the end of this chapter he makes a decision, which I will read to you now. He felt that the time had really come for making his choice. Or had his choice already been made? Yes, life had decided that for him. Life, and his own infinite curiosity about life. Eternal youth, infinite passion, pleasures subtle and secret, wild joys and wildest sins. He was to have all these things. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That was all. So here we see that Dorian makes a choice of exploring life and its pleasures. On the next day, Basil Hallward pays Dorian a visit to inform him as well about the death of Sybil Vane. And it surprises him that Dorian barely shows any sorrow of what happened and tells Basil that he has moved on. Basil switches the conversation's topic by noticing that the painting of Dorian was hidden behind a screen. Dorian tells Basil that the sunlight was too strong on the picture, which is an excuse, of course, and I will continue reading from the book. Too strong? Impossible, my dear fellow. It is an admirable place for it. Let me see it. And Hallward walked towards the corner of the room. A cry of terror broke from Dorian Gray's lips, and he rushed between Hallward and the screen. Basil, he said, looking very pale, you must not look at it. I don't wish you to. Not look at my own work? You are not serious. Why shouldn't I look at it? Exclaimed Hallward, laughing. If you try to look at it, Basil, on my word of honor I will never speak to you again as long as I live. I'm quite serious. I don't offer any explanation, and you are not to ask for any. But remember, if you touch this screen, everything is over between us. Hallward was thunderstruck. He looked at Dorian Gray in absolute amazement. He had never seen him like this before. The lad was absolutely pallid with rage. His hands were clenched, and the pupils in his eyes were like discs of blue fire. He was trembling all over. Dorian, don't speak. But what is the matter? Of course I won't look at it if you don't want me to, he said, rather coldly, turning on his heel and going over towards the window. But, really, it seems rather absurd that I shouldn't see my own work, especially as I'm going to exhibit it in Paris in the autumn. I shall probably have to give it another coat of varnish before that, so I must see it some day. But why not today? To exhibit it? You want to exhibit it? Exclaimed Dorian, a strange sense of terror creeping over him. Was the world going to be shown his secret? Were people to gape at the mystery of his life? That was impossible. So Dorian is adamant for not showing the painting. The argument continues, and ultimately Basil realizes that there is no chance for him to see the picture, and he does not want to put their friendship at risk, and he leaves Dorian's mansion. Now I will try and briefly summarize the next chapters and what is happening in the story. Lord Henry gives Dorian a book that describes the fabulous adventures of a 19th century Frenchman. It actually becomes Dorian's Bible, as he sinks ever deeper into a life of sin and corruption. And he lives a life devoted to gathering new experiences and sensations with no regards to the consequences of his actions. 18 years pass, and Dorian's reputation suffers in circles of well-mannered London society, where rumors spread. His peers, nevertheless, they continue to accept him because he remains young and beautiful. The figure in the painting, however, grows increasingly hideous, but he grew more and more charmed of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. And he would examine with minute care, and often with the monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy sensual mouth, and wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of the sin or the signs of age. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be the painted image on the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful, and yet the thing would still live on. It would be always alive. On the evening of Dorian's 38th birthday, Basil visits Dorian right before he is scheduled to leave to Paris by train. Basil tells him about the disgraceful rumors he had heard and lectures Dorian preserving his good name. This action infuriates Dorian, but he hides his emotions and decides to reveal his true soul to Basil. They go upstairs, and Dorian reveals the painting. Basil is truly shocked, of course, and demands to know what happened. Dorian mentions the moment on the day the painting was finished, that Lord Henry explained the wonder of youth, and Dorian wished that the painting would grow old instead of him. Now I will read from the book what happens next. Dorian glanced at the picture, and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him, and he detested the man who was seated at the table more than he had ever detested anything in his whole life. He glanced wildly around. Something glimmered on the top of the painted chest that faced him. His eye fell on it. He knew what it was. It was a knife that he had brought up some days before to cut a piece of cord and had forgotten to take away with him. He moved slowly towards it, passing Hallward as he did so. As soon as he got behind him, he seized it and turned around. Hallward moved in his chair as if he was going to rise. He rushed at him and dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing again and again. There was a stifled groan and the horrible sound of someone choking with blood. The outstretched arms shot up convulsively 3 times, waving grotesque stiff-fingered hands in the air. He stabbed him once more, but the man did not move. Something began to trickle on the floor. He waited for a moment, still pressing the head down. Then he threw the knife on the table and listened. He could hear nothing but the drip, drip on the carpet. He opened the door and went out on the landing. The house was quite quiet. No one was stirring. Now what happens next is that Dorian thinks of a genius plan to get away with murder. He quietly leaves the house and comes back, ringing the doorbell. His servant lets him in and tells Dorian that Basil Hallward was here to see him. His servant never saw them together, and Dorian replies that he did not see Basil, for he had to catch his train to Paris. So Dorian's alibi was solid. The next day, Dorian calls Alan Campbell and begs him to get rid of the body. When Alan refuses, Dorian threatens to blackmail him. Alan agrees and he destroys the body. In the last chapters of the book, Dorian actually fulfills a good deed. He attempts to save the life of Hetty, a country girl who has fallen in love with him. Dorian swiftly returns home to see if the painting had any positive changes, yet he finds none, except that the figure in the portrait now appears to have a deceitful smile, and this enrages Dorian as he realizes he is cursed forever. He grabs a knife and stabs the picture, followed by a loud and horrifying scream. It alerts the servants that something very bad has happened. They go upstairs to check it out, and they are horrified by what they have found. A portrait of their master, beautiful as ever, hanging on the wall. And a grotesque, hideous dead man is lying on the floor with a knife in his heart. Upon closer examination, the rings on the dead man's hand identify him as Dorian Gray.